Hi everyone, my name is Charlie. Welcome to the fourth masterclass of the Mobile Masterclass series. Today we'll be talking about art. I'm also part of the Mobile Matter team. So if ever you have any questions about this lecture or about debate in general, feel free to reach the hotline by messaging us on the Facebook page. So yeah. All right. So what are we going to cover for this lecture? First is just the general overview on what art is. Second are the different theories on the definition and also the interpretation of art. Eventually, we're also going to talk about how to interpret art on an objective point of view, like the three-prong analysis. And eventually, we're going to talk about the other topics that you can probably encounter in different art motions in debate. So things like anti-art, art and politics, and art and funding. So yeah, hopefully, it is arranged in such a way that the first concept helps you understand the last concept. So yeah. So let's start with a general overview. There are two universal definitions of art, and I think after the two bullet points that you see on the screen, everything else will be debatable from there. So on the first definition, we will define art as an expression or application of creative skill and imagination. So this then means that whatever is existing internally in the human being, so things like your thoughts, your emotions, your feelings, um, all of those things will then be manifested into something that is tangible and observable. And this can exist in different forms of art. So art motions will not just be about paintings and statues, they will be things about films, photographs, poems, etc. Second, you will define art as an examination of perceptual awareness and experience of the world around you. What does that then mean? Sorry, expression of the world around you. What that then means is that art, a lot of the time, according to Robert Irwin, shows your general experience of the world and your life. And that's why a lot of the time, then, people will assume that the way at which they consume an artwork should be in relation to the artist. So, yeah. But what you should take note of is that there's no general definition of art, or there's no correct definition of art, rather. And also that even if these two definitions are probably the most basic or universal ones that you can find, you shouldn't have to choose one between the other, and they can always coexist. So it's not something that Gov and Op have to debate about. Now, there are three purposes that you will have with art, and again, they're overlapping depending on the context. So, first is the physical, second is the personal, and finally, you have the social. So, first is the physical. Basically, it means that you have to perform a function or service, and this is probably what you will see in your day to day life, even if you're not doing it intentionally. So, things like architecture, when you see the urban planning around you, it'll also look like things like industrial design when you walk into a home. Second, it'll also look like things with personal purpose behind them. So that then means things that are to be used for personal expression or gratification. This is probably what people associate with art the most. So, for example, if you are expressing yourself through music or poetry, that is why a lot of the time artists are asked things like, so what is it about? Who is it about in particular? And all of those things manifest through art. And you don't have to be a professional artist to do it. It can literally be anyone who does it. And that's why it's one of the most popular purposes known to art. Finally, is the social purpose of art. So that means it's to address collective life. And you'll see these in things like political art, activist art, the spoliarium in the Philippines, etc. Next, we can go to the theories on the different definitions of art. Basically, this is just what people understand to be art, and this is where you now see the debatable aspect of things. So, first and foremost, the definition of art that it is a ritual. This then means that it is a gathering to promote certain beliefs. Why is this criticized? For one, it's a fact that the definition is often assuming things like shared beliefs. So, for example, let's say if your belief doesn't exist in something like a community or it isn't something that was passed down from generation to generation, then it wouldn't necessarily be considered a ritual, even if it is something that reflects your personal thoughts, something that's very close to you, etc. But second, I think it's also not able to account for art that is meant to shock or offend people. And this can look like things like abstract art, or literally any form of art that is probably different compared to the trends during that time. And the reason why that's bad then is because you will see from the different evolutions of movements that art does evolve based on trends. And no, we're not talking about trends like the fads that you will probably see online, but we're talking about, like, for example, the different art movements talk like in art history, evolving from things like realism art to different to eventually surrealism art, and then eventually after that you'll get things like Renaissance art, medieval art, etc. So yeah, that is why it's important for art to evolve. And a lot of the time, if you were always going to assume that art is a ritual, then maybe that evolution will be even more gradual than it has been like over the past few generations. The next definition of art is basically art as a matter of taste. And therefore it assumes a consensus on a standard of how you should enjoy art. And why is this criticized then? I think just standards are criticized in general because they often exclude minorities, right? Or a lot of the time, standards are just very difficult to reach as well for certain people. Maybe because it does not fall in line with their usual practices. It doesn't fall in line with their budget. It doesn't, it just doesn't fall in line with what they as an artist would want to do. It says here beauty standards in the slide specifically. That, but now that I'm explaining it to you, I guess it's not just beauty standards, but standards in general. How does that look like? A lot of the time, being a taste arbiter means that you're setting a specific standard for criticism. Um, but at the point in time where you do that, there will always be people who aren't able to confine to that standard set by the taste arbiter, and the reason for that is because standards are often indoctrinated, and taste arbiters will indoctrinate it to other taste arbiters as well, so on and so on, but it will never reach the people who weren't included in the very first place, and that's how you get a significant amount of minorities shunned out. So yeah, basically, taste can be indoctrinated. I guess that's a shorter way to put it. The final thing then is that art refers to aesthetic. So this can be defined by two things. Firstly, is that it determines beauty using human senses. So these are your five sense, your five sensory, five senses rather. Your sight, your scent, your touch, hearing, etc. Second, it's that art is grounded on the harmonization of faculties. So how does that look like? Regardless of like what genre of art you're consuming, whether it's probably a more minimalist aesthetic or something that's probably more extravagant, the reason why it's enjoyable and it can be considered an aesthetic if you group them in specific things is because these the elements that are used to create them go together, and that's a harmonization of it. What does that then mean? Why is it criticized? Basically, it's criticized for not having, for not taking into consideration artwork that is, what's the word for it? Considered traditionally beautiful. So this will look like things like abstract art. This will look like things like art that probably has unique touches on them and are purposely trying to be different. And I guess you will probably see those things now in different trends of fashion. And maybe this is something that isn't much of a problem in like certain environments that are more progressive. But if you go to other places, probably like more conservative places, that's something where the art probably isn't that welcome or something. So yeah, I guess that's just the main criticism for these things. Now let's go to the three prong analysis. And after that, we're going to be looking at how you interpret art. What's the three prong analysis? Basically, a lot of people will come into the debate saying that the way at which art is consumed and criticized will always be arbitrary, and that's why you have to regret things like award shows. You will have to regret things like funding from the state, etc. But I guess there's always a big rebuttal to that, and it's that you can always categorize art into the different like criterias that you will use to actually like critique them or maybe just consume them as a member of the audience. And if you're going to just choose three, and it's known as a three-prong analysis. It's the content, context, and material. So content is basically the thought or the meaning behind the artwork. In short, it's the message. Second is the context. So it's understanding the time and place of the artwork being created. But second is also knowing things like the background and the roots of the artist. But obviously, that's assuming if you want to be someone who always affiliates the artwork with the artist. And finally, is the material. So basically, the material properties of it, what it's made of, how it was made, etc. So on the left, you will see a photograph of a plastic crucifix submerged in urine. The photograph is by Andres Soriano and it's called Pissed Christ. Let's use the three-prong analysis to have an understanding of this artwork. So for one, um, oh sorry, not just an understanding, but also just like how you would want to frame it in debate. So yeah. So for one is the context, where it's not necessarily meant to denounce religion, but rather the commercialization of religion. How do you know that? Because the artist said so. Why is it not because other people said so? Well, it's because when you were going to listen to what other people said so, it was heavily misinterpreted and it led to a huge protest, like a lot of protests, where basically people thought, again, it was denouncing religion. Um, but there are a lot of details of it that you probably wouldn't have realized until the artist clarified what it meant. And the reason you know that it was to denounce the commercialization instead of the religion per se is because the artist said so. And later on, we're going to discuss as to why it's important to have the input of the artist and sometimes why it's not. So, yeah, obviously, the majority seeing a crucifix in urine will probably have angry reaction, but then they wouldn't notice the minor details, like, for example, how it's a plastic crucifix compared to your traditional wooden crucifix that you probably would have seen. And obviously, the plastic of it represents a commercialization. So, yeah. Context, basically the artist has a lot of the artist has a lot of roots to Spanish tradition, and basically that's why people felt like there's no doubt that it's definitely commentary on religion. So yeah, I guess it's the simplest way to put it, honestly. And finally, it's just the material. Cyberchrome, it's a fairly difficult and expensive medium to use, but because it's a photograph, it isn't necessarily that crucial in analyzing the artwork. But I think just for the understanding sake of it, the reason why material then becomes important in the three prong analysis is for things like, let's say, um, films, for example. If there's a character who is seen slaughtering or killing animals in the film, that's why from the very start of the film, before they even show a single scene, it will say that there were no animals harmed in this film. Because it's very important to clarify those things. Because a lot of the time, the material, which refers to, again, either what it's made of or the process you had to go through in order to make it, is the way at which you tell whether or not that artwork was ethically made. So yeah, maybe it's not that crucial for this example per se, but obviously for other forms of art, then that's why. Okay, so now that we understand how to analyze art, we can now go to the interpretation of it. So, yeah, I guess some people would say that you do have to connect those things and eventually apply all of this at the same time. Sorry if you hear background noise, like my chair is broken. So, yeah. First is expression theory. And a lot of people will interpret art in such a way that it's always the artist expressing themselves. And basically, what the definition here means, that it's meant to express thoughts and emotions. What is the criticism for this? The TLDR is that your thoughts, feelings, and emotions will always be temporary, but the artwork that you're producing will be permanent. That's the first thing. But second, I guess also in terms of the quality and the content of the artwork, a lot of the time artwork will create a year to make, or even 2 or 3, or an entire decade to make. Um, and throughout that time, perhaps the message that or the intention that you had when you were trying to start the artwork wouldn't have been the same like 2 years into the artwork or maybe 5 months into the artwork. And that's really important to note because the feature films that we watch will probably take more than a year to make. The albums that we listen to as well, or perhaps when we listen to artists and watch movies from the 1990s, then maybe the artists who made the film probably wouldn't have had the same perspectives they do now. How does that become important? Firstly, maybe not just because the artist is maybe not feeling the same way anymore and you shouldn't tie the artist to that, but also because maybe things like the setting would change. Like that's also why you have to consider the setting in the three prong analysis. But let's say if your world has become more progressive, what are the chances that the artist in that film doesn't believe those things anymore or something? Yeah, obviously, I think art as a platform of expression is probably like a line that you will hear whenever people will support art, like in movements, in youth organizations, and in debate arguments. People always say that the purpose of art is for expression, and that is its first and foremost purpose. But that will always be the rebuttal to it. That whatever you're expressing in art will be temporary, but your artwork will be permanent. So yeah. The next theory then is the cognitive theory, which basically implies that art embodies complex thoughts of the artist and always situates the artwork in the life of the artist. What is the criticism for that? Basically, it's criticized because of death of the author, which we will explain later. So for now, let's just talk about um, why or like how does cognitive theory manifest. For one, I think it's people always associating the artist with the artwork. And that will definitely affect how people consume the art, especially in terms of whether or not it is morally ethical to consume that art. So that'll look like things like J.K. Rowling. Maybe there are people who don't want to consume anything from the Harry Potter franchise because of her recent comments on gender and the LGBT movement. So yeah. Now we talk about death of the author, which again is the rebuttal to the cognitive theory. Death of the author is two things. Firstly, that it's unrelated to the artist, but second is that it limits the artwork. So why is that? Firstly, if it's unlimited to the artist, that means the way at which you consume the art shouldn't be shouldn't be in line with the artist. You just consume what you see in that artwork in and of itself. Maybe you can still consider things like the time at which it was published, but regardless of like regardless, you do not consider the identity of the artist. Second, then, is because it's unrelated to the artist. That's where it connects to the second bullet point, where it also sets a limit to the artwork because now you, as an artist, being unrelated to it, can no longer add things to the artwork after you've published it. How does that look like? That looks like, I guess, J.K. Rowling again, where she's actively using her platforms to write further background to characters or maybe saying events in the future. What is the criticism for this other than cognitive theory? For one, I guess it's the fact that regardless of how much time you spend, you've spent like reading all the Harry Potter books, you'll never have a full understanding of what other people know if like they have spent a good chunk of their life like following the platforms of the author. So yeah, and the reason why that becomes bad then is because, especially if it's like artwork where messaging is crucial, then people will have different understandings of that messaging, and that's why basically death of the author is criticized. So yeah. All right. Now we can go head to anti art. What is anti art? Basically, it's art that is meant to either reject prior definitions of art or reject art in general. That's the first definition. The second definition, actually, yeah, those are the two definitions rather. It also has Dadaist and surrealist roots. A quick background of Dadaism is that it takes a lot of leftist slants, and while on the other hand, surrealism also takes a lot of um, a lot of, what's the word for it, anarchist slants, especially during the time at which surrealism flourished, because during the surrealism period, that was totally after realism, where realism was probably going to depict day-to-day life at the time. So that's why there were a lot of paintings which showed farmers doing their jobs, showing labor. Or if you were to see surrealist art right now, I guess in the time of this lecture at least, probably you'll see things about the pandemic, you'll see things about war going on and political conflict, and all of those things will fall under surrealism. So yeah, um, we'll discuss it more later on. But I guess it's just already like a quick grasp of what anti-art is, right? Like basically, you're just criticizing either prior definitions of art or art as a whole. Yeah. Why is that? So if you are a person who supports anti-art, then why would you support it? Two reasons. For one, it's probably because you believe that art is not universal but rather peculiar to Europe, the standards of Europe rather. How does that come into place? It's just going back to the whole conversation about how a lot of the time art will box people out. Art will not take into consideration minorities. And in the same way, it's also because art can be considered capitalist, and that's another way of boxing people out, but rather based on socioeconomic class. So yeah, there are different reasons as to why art will be considered as to why art will be considered capitalist. It isn't included in the lecture, unfortunately, but I think Mobile Matter has published a matter brief about it, so you can go check it out. Um, and basically, there's an entire discussion there about how art is a market. A lot of the time, yeah, you can check out the most expensive paintings out there. You can check out how, basically, like a lot of the time, trading art is very similar to like is somewhat considered an alternative for currency, because art has high value. And yeah, we'll also discuss later how the value of art will then affect other aspects of life. But yeah, to this discussion specifically on anti-art, that is why people will not support art, because they think it's capitalist. All right, now that we're done with that, let's go to art and politics. All right, so basically, we're going to start with state propaganda, by the way. Basically, propaganda refers to biased and or misleading content. I'd probably say information that is used to promote specific beliefs to the audience that is consuming it. So, how does that look like? It will look like things like monuments funded by the state, posters funded by the state, and films produced by the state. What are examples of these? You will still see monuments in the different places you'll go to. A lot of the time, it's places that are probably considered tourist attractions, because they want to set up monuments in places that a lot of people visit. These places are often public, etc. Second are posters, but unfortunately now you don't see that many posters, because things are just becoming more digital. But on the left side of the screen, you will see Uncle Sam, which is basically a poster that the United States government used prior to World War One, where citizens were encouraged to join the United States Army. So that's what the poster meant when it says "I want you." So yeah, now we also have films, and I think for the films aspect of it, I think it's quite interesting. um there was a point in time where propaganda films are very prominent, especially in the Philippines. I guess a good example of this would be Dawn of Freedom. I forgot what year this was, but in around the 1960s and 70s, propaganda films were very prominent. Basically, it's a film that that wants to forward and promote Japanese occupation to the Philippines. And basically, what you'd see in the film is that in the very subtle interactions of the characters, the Japanese soldiers would be very appealing to the audience, since they were majority male soldiers. They were depicted to be very fatherly to the children in the Philippines. They were depicted to be very patient with the fellow Filipino soldiers. And also, there were just like a lot of heroic scenes from them where they would be giving food to the Filipinos, etc. While on the other hand, there are scenes where an American soldier would be speaking with a Filipino laborer rather, and they'd be telling them to reach a very soon, fast approaching deadline, to work before Christmas, to work on the holidays, etc. And basically, since at this point they were trying to show that you have to push the Americans out of your lives and you have to welcome Japanese occupation, that's what this film shows. And the reason why films became a tool in propaganda, aside from things like posters, is because it's, I would say, subtle to an extent. So it's not things like that are telling you to be what's the word for it? Like, it's not similar to like informative platforms where they're very direct, where they're telling you directly to do something, but rather it's them trying to show it in like day-to-day content that you probably would have consumed normally, and you maybe didn't even know that it was propaganda at the time. This has also happened in more recent events. I apologize, but it's another it's another Filipino example. But for example, you would see the film on Bato de la Rosa, where, for example, there was I think it was the midterm election approaching, and he was trying to get a seat in the Senate, and eventually the film showcases him trying to save people in several scenes, depicting him to be a hero, a good politician, etc. And but obviously there are limits to that since there are different campaign periods during election. But nonetheless, films do become a crucial tool in propaganda. All right, so now let's talk about art and social movements. Okay, so basically, if you go to the Met in New York, um, around 85% of art 85% of nude art will be women, or like at the very least, like the traditional female body that you would expect. Um, while on the other hand, less than 5% would be from female artists. And obviously, from there, that really shows as to, for one, a lot of the time women are being objectified, but the people who are objectifying them are men. So, yeah. And in general, it'll just show that a lot of the artists which become successful are men in general. So, yeah. Obviously, this is for gender. Um, I'd say there are also other aspects as well. Like, for example, let's look at how LGBT characters are portrayed in films and TV shows, for example. There are a lot of issues there. Like, for one, it's very subtle, but a lot of the time the gay character is also the first to be killed, and you will see this in Dynasty. I won't say which, like, Dynasty is a TV show. I won't say which character because then that will be an even bigger spoiler. But yeah, like, they're the first to be killed, and sometimes you don't realize those things. But obviously, the more obvious ones, but still, we don't really criticize them that much. Unless like you're actually someone who is observing these things, is that a lot of the time the gay characters there will either be there for entertainment purposes, like for example in the 90s, when in 90s American films where lesbian kisses were heavily used for entertainment and not really representation. So gay characters are there, but they aren't necessarily for representation. um and you will also see things like characters who are part of the LGBT community, but they still fulfill traditional beauty standards. They are white, they are tall, they are slim fit, etc. All right, I'm assuming that's enough to cover here. Um, yeah, there are obviously like other aspects of social movements that are discussed in art. But I think for this lecture specifically, those are the ones that I want to focus on. To save up on time. All right. And finally, we can go to art and funding. So, what are the different reasons that the state should fund art? For one, it's because of things like economic growth. The examples I have here are tourism and creative industries. Tourism will look like things like investing into museums, and this is probably more prominent in countries like France and Italy. Basically, a lot of people will fly to specific countries to go to their museums, and a lot of the time, they will also pay tickets to enter those museums, and a lot of those will generate a good amount of money, like millions of dollars and stuff. Yeah, like really big digits. I think that's the best way to put it. And obviously, all of those things will go back to your GDP. All of those things will go back to the minimum wage that people are able to receive, and just how much like recognition your country actually gets as well. And when those things happen, because the way at which you invest into museums, like you know how museums work, they will feature a lot of the time historic art. History is something that doesn't necessarily have an expiration date. It's not a trend or a fad that will go away, but like something that becomes more and more valuable as time passes. And that's why people will keep coming back to it and becomes like a permanent thing to invest to. And that's why people are willing to invest into it for economic growth. So yeah, like you can assure that people will keep flying to Europe to visit their artworks, regardless of like yeah, regardless of like how much time has passed, or even the fact that when you invest into it so much, you'll even keep coming back even if you've seen it before. Like if you go to things like the Louvre in France, it's unlikely that you'll be able to finish that in a single day. So even if you've visited that before, there are high chances that you'll even want to visit it again if you have the financial capacity to do so. It'll also look like things like creative industries. So what will fall under this? It'll maybe look like your things like the film industry, the media industry, etc. But it can also just look like things like NGOs. All of those things fall under creative industries. So yeah. The second reason then to fund art is because of things like educational assets, so career skills. Um, don't mistake this for, let's say, only people who step into courses in the arts, because a lot of careers do require creative skill. So how does that look like? For example, let's look at let's say the corporate world, right? Like let's say if you are someone who's about to start a business, you will probably need creativity in your branding, in your slogan, etc. But also in the marketing aspect of it, you will need to understand not just social media analytics, but also what are the best ways at which people want to consume videos, like what do they want to see in the video, what are the new trends going on, etc. What's another example? I think it's also just the fact that marketing will exist in other industries as well, right? And we already explained how marketing requires creative skill. So yeah, even in the sciences, especially with AI right now, you guys have seen AI generated art. You guys have seen I guess like a lot of AI that tries to create like humans and stuff. For one, I think you have to be creative in order to start you know, something that you want to discover more, like research. But also just like in terms of how you approach those things, it's just having a creative mind, and I guess also critical mind that you have to you know, just like come up with bigger and bigger and newer ideas that would actually come up with something new that will benefit society. And all of these fall under you know, creative thinking. All of these things will fall under career skills. Finally is health and well-being. um Sorry, health and wellness rather. um I think this is probably not as common as the examples that we had just mentioned. Sorry, as the benefits that we have just mentioned. And I guess this is probably a good time to say that perhaps in debates you should um prioritize these from the top part going to the lowest part, because a lot of the time these are the ones that are you are able to impact the most in debates. But yeah, basically a lot of art is used for recreational purposes, and a lot of art is used for therapy as well. So something as simple as painting can be used for recreation, but also it can be used for therapy. Like for example, a lot of soldiers who are recovering from PTSD are told to opt into art. A lot of the time also it can be used for rehabilitation purposes as well. That's why you will see some prisons that they will yeah, some prisons, especially in more progressive countries, will require yeah, will require prisoners to yeah, make things like bracelets or any form of art, really. Obviously whatever is feasible in the environment they're in. I've also put down here cultural heritage, but obviously this can manifest in different ways. I think what you should note here is that if you invest into things like let's say for economic growth, then that also will tie back to things like cultural heritage, because if more people are visiting your country, then that also increases how known your culture is for that how known your country is for that culture, etc. But now let's go to state funding in general. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide for this. But yeah, you will also see a lot of debates about state funding. From time to time, I've seen this motion, especially in Asians tournaments, like Asians format tournaments, where it would go like, would you would abolish state funding as a whole. Um, I think a lot of the time people veto that motion because it's hard to think of reasons as to why you would abolish state funding, because you have all these benefits on the screen right now. Um, but I guess just like, yeah, it's not a motion that I would like opt for, but I think just the criticism against state funding is that it really shows what the state supports, and sometimes it can be good because maybe it can be the state taking a more progressive stance. And that's, let's say, if they fund artwork that supports the LGBT community, obviously that's good. But then there are some people who will say state funding will, be bad. You should probably abolish it because your state, especially if it's conservative, is probably likely to fund, controversial conservative beliefs. Maybe they're going to fund religious art. Maybe they will fund racist art. And all of those things are bad. Um, Funding from the state is also very crucial in the sense that what the state funds will affect how the people react. So, in the Piss Christ example we had a while ago, when the state decided to fund it, that's how all the protests happened. It did not have protests when it was just another controversial piece of art that the state didn't fund yet. So yeah, as for private funding, um, there are a lot of reasons as to why people would fund art. Again, we mentioned a lot of the time art is also a market. So when it's used a lot in trade, that's also another reason as to why you'd fund it. Or perhaps when art is sold in things like galleries, etc. Galleries are also another thing to consider because, for example, maybe if you were to put your artwork in that gallery and they help you sell it, you don't get the full amount of it anymore, and so on and so on. There aren't much debate motions about this, but these are just some of the issues that you can also encounter in art motions that I encourage you guys to touch upon. So yeah, I guess this is where I'm going to end the lecture. But if you have any questions, and if you want to like look at other examples, you can either go to the Mobile Matter hotline, that's sending a message in the Facebook page, and I can get back to you directly there. Or if you want the input of other team members, then go for it. Or you can just go to the matter brief that we posted. We have additional examples there, also a further discussion on art as a market, and yeah, so on. That's all. So again, my name's Charlie. Thanks for having me. Hoping you learned a thing or two from this lecture.